Thank you, friends, for joining us this day in the study of the Old Testament. We are studying from the book of Isaiah, a prophet that lived 700 years before our Lord was born. One of the major prophets identified by men as the Messianic prophet, and he was that. He spake of the Christ. But the prophecies that we've studied at this point are not ones that relate directly to Christ. They're ones that have to do with the nations around them at that time. And we do this in order that we must show that Isaiah did prophesy about the Christ, many prophecies of them, but he also spake of the nations around and the people of his time and the things that connected his nation, and that he was exactly right on the things he prophesied. To prophesy means to speak beforehand. It means to bubble up like a fountain. And a prophet was one that was inspired by God. He did not speak from himself, but spake as the Spirit gave him utterance. And as we're looking today, we're looking at the Babylonian exile of the nation of Judah. This was that was of a period in the latter part of, in the 600s BC. And the first group of exiles went into exile about 606 BC. Then for the next 20 years, two other groups followed them, and finally, in 587 or 86 BC, Babylon was destroyed the city of Jerusalem, carried what remained there of the people into exile, destroyed the temple, and the land lay waste. Now you'll remember, as we studied in our last week's study, that Hezekiah had done a very foolish thing. He had been very, very ill. By the power of God and through a miracle of God, he had recovered from his illness. The king of Babylon had heard about it at that time. It was an insignificant nation as far as other nations were concerned. And the king, having heard of the recovery of Hezekiah, sent men that were his messengers to commend Hezekiah on his return to illness and to give his greetings. Hezekiah was flattered by this, I suppose, and he welcomed the messengers from Babylon and the king, and he did something he should not have done. He showed them all the treasures that he had, all the riches and the things that had been his fathers and grandfathers before him. And Isaiah asked him who the men were, where they came from, what they'd seen in his house. Hezekiah held nothing back. He simply told him that he'd seen everything in his house. And Isaiah gave the prediction that we studied in our last week's lesson. Those that were the seed of Hezekiah would go into exile into the land of that king. Well, that was a part of the exile and a part of the people that did go into exile. But we must not suppose nor think for one moment that it was one foolish act by Hezekiah that brought about this ruin and this havoc to the nation. No, the nation of Israel had been that as a united people, and then 10 tribes withdrew. They bore the name of Israel, and the two remaining groups that remained faithful to Jehovah was Judah and Benjamin. And as we look at that nation of Judah, just like Israel to the north of them, they displeased God in many ways. Isaiah writes of these people and says in the very first chapter of the book of Isaiah these words, "The ox knows his owner, the ass his master's crib, but my people do not know, my people do not consider." As the apostle or as the prophet speaks in this first chapter, he speaks of the sins of the people. It wasn't just Hezekiah's wrong. That was one foolish act. But the people themselves rebelled against God. They sought the gods of the land. They made images of those gods. They bowed down and worshiped them. And they forsook the Lord God. In this chapter, in the first chapter, God was willing to forgive them. He said, "Come now, let's reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool." And Hezekiah wasn't the only king that acted foolishly. As we look at the kings before him, there were many, many wicked men. And then after him, Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, and his grandson were ones that were far more wicked than Hezekiah. For Hezekiah was, in many ways, a very good king. But for one foolish thing, his descendants were to be in exile for 70 years. And so, as we look, we find that along with the descendants of Hezekiah, God predicted that there would be that there would be also the exile of the entire nation. When we look in the book of Isaiah, in the 47th chapter, we find that the prophet talks about the fact that that exile was to take place. Let me read from the book of Isaiah, the 47th chapter. God is speaking in regard to Babylon, and God speaks and says that I was wroth with my people. I profaned mine inheritance, and I gave them into thy hand. Thou didst show them no mercy. Upon the aged hast thou very heavily laid thy yoke. And as we look at these words, we find that God is speaking of Babylon, and God says, I gave them into your hand. They did go into exile. We'll find many times later that there were prophecies that God made about the rebuilding of the temple and of the repopulating of the nation of Jerusalem, all which by necessary inference demands the fact that for it to be repopulated and for the temple to be rebuilt, it had to be destroyed and the people had to be taken from it. And that was at the hands of the king Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. When we look at the time that Isaiah made these prophecies, Isaiah was looking into the future. The event of the exile would be 120 years in the future. And at the time that Isaiah was speaking, the nation Babylon was not a nation to be feared. It was a second-rate nation. And though it had fame in years before, at that time it was at a low point in its history. Yet God pointed to the fact that it was going to rise again. It wasn't Babylon, of which Judah was fearful of and was a threat to them in Isaiah's day. It was the kingdom to the north of them, Assyria. And Assyria was that inundated Syria and inundated Samaria, took them away. And while Syria did return, Samaria never did return from that exile that Assyria laid upon them. And yet we find that Judah survived the ravages of Assyria. And we've studied about that a couple of weeks ago. But as we look at the time that Isaiah is speaking, he's speaking of something that was going to happen 100 years in the future. And as he speaks about these things, he tells that God would give the people of Judah into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, and that Babylon would carry them away into exile. As we look in the histories that were written in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and then much of the book of Isaiah, we find that the prophets there, the historians, show that the nation of Judah, small, insignificant, was one that was a servitude to Babylon, but rebelled against them. And Babylon came against them, gave them opportunities, and the treatment that they received probably would not be nearly so harsh if the grandson and the son of Hezekiah had not been one that had stiffened their necks and resisted against the overtures. Babylon's armies came, Nebuchadnezzar came. They came through the land, they took the countries, the cities, and the villages and then they surrounded Jerusalem. And as we've seen, they destroyed the city, and they destroyed, as it were, the temple that Solomon had built many, many years before. But the prophet Isaiah did not stop with these prophecies. He foretold that the nation of Judah would carry it into the hands of the Babylonians, and that they would destroy their city, they would destroy their temple. But He likewise foretold the fact that Babylon, that was so great and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and exiled the Jews, was going itself to suffer defeat. And they would suffer the defeat at the hands of a nation near them. And that nation was the Medes and the Persians. Now think about it, my friend. Here is the prophet Isaiah. He's looking into the future. He's telling about a nation that's going to rise, and then a nation whose decline will be as suddenly as was its rise. When he speaks of the defeat of the nation of Babylon, and he tells us about that, in the 13th chapter, he tells us in Isaiah, the 13th chapter, that Babylon was going to fall, and then Babylon was going to fall at the hands of the Medes. Now think about it. Here the prophet spake 200 years. He tells about the defeat of this nation that was Babylon that would yet rise, and tells the very name of the people that would defeat it, the Medes and the Persians. That was very significant. But not only does the prophet tell us that, as we look in the 44th chapter, the 45th chapter, the 46th chapter of the prophet Isaiah, there are many more prophecies that are related. Not only would Babylon suffer defeat by the hands of the Medes, but God, through his voice prophet, Isaiah, predicted something else. He predicted that that country, the Medes, would be ones that would allow those that were taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar to go home. And he wouldn't charge them anything. He wouldn't take ransom of them to be allowed to go home. That within itself was interesting. And as we look, we find that not only did the prophet tell that the people would go home without a ransom paid for their deliverance, but he tells that the temple would be rebuilt and the city of Jerusalem would be repopulated, and that the villages and the cities of Judah would likewise be restored. How could he know that? How could he know that? He knew that because God was using him and speaking to him. And so we find that just as the prophet Isaiah predicted, the decades turned into a century, and the centuries turned into a couple of them. And the Medes did come, and the Medes did defeat Babylon, and the Medes did allow those nations that Babylon had taken into captivity, including Judah, to go home again, and then gave them resources to help to rebuild their beautiful temple that once had been the glory of the nation. But my friends, one of the most marvelous things of all these prophecies have to do with the wisdom of God, and that causes us to be awed by what God can do. And that is that God not only said it would be the Medes that would defeat the nation of Babylon, but more than that, 180 years before this man came to power, God caused Isaiah to call his name, to name what he was doing. We're reading from the 44th chapter of the book of Isaiah, and God says, of Jerusalem she shall be inhabited, of the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will raise up the waste places thereof, that saith to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up the rivers, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He shall perform all my pleasures, saying, even of Jerusalem thou shalt be built, and thy temple, thy foundation shall be laid. God said, Cyrus is my shepherd. He's going to do what I want him to do. And then as he speaks of Cyrus further, he talks about the fact that for his people's name he'd called him. He says, you haven't known me. And in fact, he was not even born yet. It would be 140 or 50 years before there'd be a man born named Cyrus. But God said, I've called you a name for the glory of my people. Isn't that marvelous? Isn't that wonderful? How could Isaiah know all of that? He could not, my friends. The only way that Isaiah could know that was that there was an eternal God that sees the end from the beginning, that is everlasting, that is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And that God who sees from the beginning to the end knew what was going to happen, and he told Isaiah these things, and Isaiah wrote those things. This is that does two wonderful things. First of all, it tells us there is an eternal God. He is from everlasting to everlasting. Jehovah is his name. It tells us another marvelous truth, and that is that the book we call the Bible is that he authored and comes from him. It is the one book that we can have confidence, complete confidence in. The prophecies of Isaiah are varied and multiplied. And we're going to look in our next time at another prophecy, a prophecy about Babylon and the final end of her. We hope that you'll choose to join us, that you will consider these things, look at the scriptures, and if you desire the prophecies, the scriptures that we've used today, contact the website, give us information how to send you the information, and we'll see that you get it. Thank you for listening. May God bless you. May he guide your way. And may it be that you are profoundly aware of the fact that there is a God. Isaiah was his prophet, and the Bible is his word.